Dr Manjir and welcome to Hidden Science. This week we'll be exploring the nature of consciousness. Is it just a side effect of the brain, or is there something more fundamental about it? My guests this week are Dr Chris Clark, former Professor of Applied Mathematics, Dr Jude Currivan, cosmologist and award-winning Hay House author, and Dr Serena Roney-Dougal, who has spent 30 years exploring parapsychology. But first, as ever, here's our Hidden Science roving reporter Grace Willis with her report on the nature of consciousness.
For centuries, science has explored everything from the cosmos to the genome. But what has been neglected until now is how we can explore all of this in the first place. How do we have any thoughts at all? The hot topic in science is, what exactly is consciousness? And to answer that question, there are three main camps. Many fall into the first camp, that consciousness is just an epiphenomenon, or side effect of the brain. This camp believes there is nothing special about the fact that we can think. It is just an accident of the organ that sits in our heads. But what this doesn't explain is how all of these neurons can lead to having an inner experience, which is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness. Then there is the other extreme, who take their cue from quantum physics and the famous double-slit experiment, which says that subatomic particles behave as waves or as point particles depending on how we measure them. This camp concludes that there is something about consciousness that is fundamental to reality because our very observations can alter an experiment. Some would go so far as saying that consciousness is the ground of all being and that matter arises from mind and not the other way around. And then in between, there is another camp put forward by scientists such as Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. They say that consciousness is caused by some sort of quantum entanglement between the 0 point field and structures called microtubules in the neurons of the brain. It is not exactly clear how this leads to an inner experience, but the idea has its proponents. So which of the three camps will our guest decide to be in today? Let's go back to the studio with Manjir to find out.
Thank you for that, Grace. My first guest today is Dr Chris Clark, who has been Professor of Applied Mathematics at the University of Southampton. He's published many books and papers in general relativity, cosmology and the physics of the brain. In 2009, he went freelance to work on the links between science and spirituality, and he's served on 2 Institute of Physics editorial boards and is the former chair of the Scientific and Medical Network. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Glad to be here.
Now, that's quite a CV, and you've very much been, having been a Professor of Applied Mathematics, you've been very much in the mainstream. But how is it that you've ended up shifting from that to sort of studying science and spirituality, as it were?
Well, I've always had a strong interest in spirituality. I think from the time of my first entering a university as an undergraduate, where I had one of these sort of evangelical Christian experiences. But I think what really switched me on was when I started realizing that psychology actually had a lot to say about all this, that the way in which we know things is something which we really need to take on board. We can't just assume that the world is a machine and then press on. We see the world, we know the world in some way, and therefore we've got to look both at the way the world is and what seems to be happening, but in order to do that, we first of all got to understand how we are and how it is that we perceive the world. And so that's a sort of sketch of where I'm coming from.
So a lot of the time in science, the aspect of consciousness and how we can think about anything in the first place, that's been the one thing that's been sort of ignored. But sometimes you speak about quantum physics changing all that and introducing something different. Could you talk about that at all, and how quantum physics is related to consciousness, perhaps?
Yes. I mean, when quantum theory started up, it was, very, very exciting and very extraordinary. But it was realised in the very early stages, really, that there was actually something missing from quantum theory. And that's been the case right up to now, that quantum theory is brilliant at describing things on the average. It can tell you with extreme precision just what is the probability for anything happening, but it can say nothing about what it is that makes something actually happen, be there. And this is very much reflected in the way we think about things, that we've got this language bit which analyses what's going on and pins things down, but it never gets to the actual happening of something, the actual appearance of a real thing. You can write down all the equations you like. This is what Wheeler said. You can write down all the equations on a piece of paper that express the whole of physics. You put it down, but a universe does not appear. And so this extra dimension, which we think of something to do with consciousness, and we ought to say a bit about what we mean by that. But it's absolutely necessary. It would be necessary even if we didn't have quantum theory. We've got to make this link between actual being, actual presence, and talking about things and writing about things.
So in a way, do you think that quantum physics introduced an idea that the universe is a bit more nebulous than we previously thought in the sort of what's known as the Newtonian paradigm?
Well, it introduces the idea that it's more flexible than what we thought. The Newtonian paradigm had everything pinned down and there was no room for anything else. The great thing about quantum theory is that it has gaps in it, that there are things that don't fit, there are sort of openings whereby things can happen. Leonard Cohen's famous line, there is a gap in everything, that's where the light gets in. That's what quantum theory gives us. It's a chink saying, look, all this calculation is not all there is to it, there is something else. And it's that something else. And then what I want to do is to be faithful to the science, be faithful to the exactness of the science, but also become aware of the something else, of being. And consciousness is a very ambiguous word, but consciousness sort of slots in on the being side rather than on the calculating side.
It's a very sort of difficult to define word, isn't it? And a lot of people have started using the word quantum all over the place, and and there's often a link that is created by some physicists, not all, that the wave-particle duality aspect of quantum physics shows that there's something about our observation and consciousness that is more significant than we previously thought. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yes, and I'm not sure how that fits in with waves and particles, but the fact that there is this gap in quantum theory, and the fact that quantum theory cannot actually in itself bridge this gap, means that there needs to be something else. There needs to be a notion of being, actually. I mean, I would regard consciousness as knowing by being as opposed to knowing by talking. And you and I here, we're talking to each other, but it works as a proper conversation rather than a couple of computers signaling information, because we are beings and we are in the same place and we are aware of each other. My being is reaching out to yours, and yours probably is reaching out to me, and so on. So,
that's something that was previously completely ignored by science, isn't it? And so with the observer effect in quantum physics, I mean, how do you think that relates to the notion of consciousness?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. I think it is consciousness which which allows things to come into being.
Could you explain what the observer effect is, the importance of an observer?
Well, again, I sort of put slight sort of brackets around that idea, but it started off in 1939 with there was a very famous paper by London and Bower who were saying that you can pursue the line of what reacts on what for as long as you like, but at some point this train of reactions has to stop, and you have to have something actually materializing which is solid. And they said that there is something particular about the observer because the observer can reflect on him or herself, that there's something self-reflective about it. So that's what they originally meant by it, that the buck somehow stops at a point where the thing becomes complete, in a sense. They said it was complete because the observer can know their own self, but I think it's the same sort of thing as what I would mean by being, that the observer, because I am aware of myself, because there is something that it is like to be me, which is what I mean by consciousness, because there is that knowing what it is to be like by me, in a sense enables me to extend and connect myself with the world. It enables me to actually allow things to happen in the world in relation to me. So everything stops being the sort of theory and calculations and starts becoming being, happening.
So there's a saying, isn't there, that a lot of physicists are happy to just shut up and calculate, but you're saying that there's more to it. We've got to look at these gaps and what these gaps are saying, and what the very fact that we are beings who are interacting with the universe, what does that say? Okay, I'm going to ask you a hard question now, but I mean, what do you think is consciousness? What do you think is the nature of consciousness?
Well, what I mean by this elusive word, I mean, I don't think, because there's a word, there doesn't necessarily have to be a single thing that the word is attached to. So when I talk about consciousness, I really mean the nature of what it is for a being to be that being. So consciousness is this awareness of selfhood. That's what I mean by consciousness. Lots of people mean something totally different by the word, but for me, that's what it is. And for me, that's our sort of core way of knowing things and engaging with the universe. And it's not just us, this is the point, that if consciousness, well, if we're talking about what it is like to be a being, then that's something which we can see happening in our dogs, we can see it happening in the frogs in my pond, and I would say that whenever you have something which can sort of integrate itself into a whole, then that complete whole can have what it is like to be it. In other words, consciousness. It's not because it's thinking or calculating or saying intelligent things. That has nothing to do with consciousness. It just is. That's what consciousness is.
And how do you think that fits in with what you've just said, how you described quantum physics, that things come into being and they're a bit more nebulous than we previously thought?
Well, what that idea of consciousness enables to happen is that one can move from the nebulousness of quantum theory, which is nebulous in a way because we are trying to apply calculations to a domain which cannot be encompassed by calculations, then consciousness can actually bring out something concrete out of what is inevitably fuzzy because we're not engaging our right way of knowing. I think we have to be very precise about how we argue and do our mathematics and all the rest of it, because that's wonderful stuff and it tells us lots. And equally, I think we have to be very clear about how far it gets and the importance of knowing and relationship. I mean, the relationship comes from consciousness.
That's fascinating, but we need to go for a break now, so
Yep.
we'll come back to that. See you in a few minutes. Welcome back. We're talking about consciousness today, the nature of consciousness, and with me is Dr. Chris Clark. So you were speaking before the break about what you understand as consciousness, and there is a line of thought that comes out of quantum physics that says that because of wave-particle duality, and that it's the observer that appears to bring the wave into, out of this nebulous state into being, that consciousness is fundamental to reality. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would agree with that. That without consciousness, you don't have reality. You don't have real things. You just have nebulous thoughts, the possibility of things. And the universe consists of lots of structures, of equations and fields which are doing things, but none of that actually brings things into being. That's just the sort of potentiality for something to happen. The laws don't produce things.
So it's quite an interesting take on it that you've got, because some people say basically consciousness is almost like a ground, like Amit Goswami, for example, says consciousness is the ground of all being, that actually physical matter actually comes out of consciousness itself. But you're sort of saying a slightly different take on this.
Well, I think he and I use the word consciousness in a different sense.
Yeah.
I think we're just talking about different things.
Yeah.
I think it is the case that there is a ground from which the universe comes. I wouldn't say that ground is consciousness, as if consciousness were some sort of stuff like beer or something that you could take some of. I would say that consciousness is a property of certain beings, of all true beings, in fact.
Right, okay. So do you think that consciousness extends beyond the brain, or is it a property of the brain?
I think our being extends beyond our brain, certainly. I think who we are, what we are in our essence, is something which is greater than what's up here. But as I say, I don't think there's a stuff called consciousness which sort of oozes out of the brain and sort of wafts over things. I think we have to be clearer about what things we can pin down and describe precisely, and what things are very much in the realm of relationship, and very much in the realm of inner experience, where we can't match them by talking about it, but we can allude to them. We can try and get each other to sort of point towards the real being within themselves. But that's something that we can't actually pin down by equations or anything like this. So to try and say that this essence of being is something which you can tag on to equations of quantum theory is just, a friend of ours said it's like looking for verbs in the refrigerator. It's putting together things that just are meaningless together.
So that's really interesting. So you're actually of a school of thought that keeps them separate. And so it's kind of like you're going beyond just the brain there into this sort of sense of beingness, which is maybe traditionally what people might call the soul or spirit. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's something that you talk about sometimes about the hard problem of consciousness. What is that exactly?
Yes, and there again, I think different people mean different things.
David Chalmers described the hard...
Yes, yeah. I suppose when Chalmers introduces this, he's trying to pull people away from the idea that consciousness is just something to do with data processing. People talk about, well, can a computer be conscious? Can you make it so complicated that it becomes conscious? And David Chalmers was saying, no, the real problem we've got to crack is not how we make a computer more and more complicated until it's conscious, but how we actually jump into a sort of different way of thinking and a different way of being about the whole thing, where we need to do things in a different way. We need to engage different ways of knowing. It's no good just being cleverer with our equations. We need to actually be more empathic with ourselves and with other people. So it's that other dimension which we need to bring in.
So the hard problem really is, how do all these neurons actually create the experience, isn't it? Because we know that the brain does things, but that I think that's sort of coming into the hard problem, isn't it? So going on to the issue of artificial intelligence, I mean, machines, can they, in your opinion, actually end up being sort of almost like humanoids like us? I mean, do you think we're ever going to see that day where we have a totally autonomous robot, as it were, that can think for itself?
I think this is interesting, because I think this is just where quantum theory comes in, actually. That the way we do computers at the moment, they're essentially glorified calculators. When I started off in physics, we had mechanical calculators where you actually, the Brunswiga, where you turn a handle and the numbers start flicking around. And computers are actually just a very elaborate and complicated version of that. You can make them as big as they like, but they're still machines. The question of, can we make a computer which is so complicated and intricate that it's conscious? Or indeed, what you mentioned a little while ago, can we, by thinking of the neurons as if they were computers, can we get consciousness out of that? We're looking in the wrong place. And this is where the quantum theory comes in. I think that what allows consciousness to come into being is not how many connections you have between all the little bits and pieces, but the extent to which the whole gels as a whole physical being. And quantum theory, because it has this action at a distance, as it were, this coherence within it, which is quite different from classical physics, that enables things to gel together as a whole, as a single being. And so it's not a matter of complexity. You can, I would want to say, in fact, that a minute cell in the body can, in a very, very primitive way, be conscious, in the sense that it is a thing, it is a being. Consciousness is not a matter of complexity, it's a matter of coherence.
Okay, so it's basically the brain kind of working as a whole, would you say? Right, okay.
Or parts of the brain working as a whole. I mean, the brain is enormously complicated, and what we think of as, what I think of as me, is actually just a sort of slice through all the stuff which is going on in my brain, which I suppose the spiritual disciplines are to do with actually extending that and trying to extend this sense of being in one way to a greater beingness within myself, but also with a greater encompassing of this being into other things.
Okay, so to summarise, you don't think it's a consciousness is fundamental. You think that it's from the brain, but also beingness is very important as well, and that's something that, and there's different schools of thought, aren't there, with consciousness as well. There's also something called the Hameroff-Penrose model, and which we may be able to talk about later. How did your colleagues take you talking about this sort of thing? Because a lot of people don't put physics and consciousness together, do they? How did they react to you?
I didn't talk about it while I was in the university. No, I mean there is such a big gulf between. Well, what I was working in was astrophysics, which is sort of very mechanical, and really I don't think those other people in my department were necessarily all that interested in these sort of things from an academic point of view. Though it was interesting, I actually got into the whole thing by talking to somebody who was interested in acupuncture and ways of applying magnetic fields to acupuncture and that sort of thing. And so there are sort of links over there, but trying to link up cosmology and stars and things like that with it, no, non-starter.
So you think there's no link between there, really? Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm very cautious about sort of
Yeah,
trying to link
yeah.
things up.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your story with us and your opinion. So I'm putting you into the camp of it's consciousness and the brain today. So would you agree with that? Yes.
Up to a point.
Up to a point. Up to a point. Up to a point. Thank you very much for joining us today. So join us after the break. Welcome back to the show. Today we're exploring the nature of consciousness. So is consciousness an accident or something more fundamental? My next guest to help answer this is Dr. Jude Currivan. She has a master's degree in quantum physics and cosmology from Oxford University, a PhD in archaeology, and she's also had a successful business career and is the author of 5 books, most of which are published by Hay House. Welcome to the show, Jude.
Thanks, Manjir. It's lovely to be here.
So, what's your take on the connection between quantum physics and consciousness?
Oh, my Lord.
Big question.
It is and it isn't, actually. I think we need to get beyond quantum physics to some degree. But to actually, the context, for me, my definition of consciousness is very broad. Others may have a more narrow definition. But for me, it starts with an experienced worldview where all that we call reality is consciousness expressing itself as energy. And of course, energy is quantized, and that enables a vast interplay of perspectives. You know, we may call it duality or something else, but a vast interplay of perspectives to be played out and explored by and through consciousness.
So you're firmly in the camp of consciousness is fundamental.
I am firmly in the camp of consciousness is fundamental. And I suppose that's because I've experienced it as such all my life. I came to the science some years after I actually began to experience what we could call multidimensional realities, and a very, very broad realization, because it is real to me, that everything that we call reality is consciousness. Or, you know, Einstein called it cosmic mind. John Wheeler has talked about, you know, mind. And I don't think anybody really agrees on a definition of consciousness, but my definition is essentially that.
But it's not all physicists that would say the same. I mean, it's definitely a specialist group, isn't it?
Well, I think more and more physicists, as we have this emerging paradigm coming forward of a fractal, holographic, informational, entropic universe, they're more likely to be much more comfortable with the idea of an informational based universe. But to be honest, I don't know how you can stop the slippery slope once you acknowledge that information is more fundamental than space-time, matter-energy, and once you have to go beyond the ostensible physical universe to be able to try and explain or describe it in scientific terms, then you are definitely on the slippery slope to trying to understand the fundamental importance of consciousness.
Well, let's go a bit further down the slippery slope then, because you know, a lot of people sort of take another concept from quantum physics, which is about non-locality.
Indeed.
And they relate that to consciousness.
Yes.
So what exactly is non-locality?
Well, Einstein didn't really like it. He called it spooky action at a distance. But it's an innate attribute of not just quantum systems, but at the time initially it was thought just to be at the quantum level, where you can create twin particles, separate them by this much or the size of a galaxy, switch the attributes of one and the other will immediately switch with no signal going between them within space-time, because light is the limiting speed within space-time.
So it's not like there's like internet or anything like that going through them.
No.
Somehow they know what the other one is doing.
They are literally non-locally interconnected beyond, if you like, the limitations of a signal transporting between them. But since their original hypothesis, because it was just a theoretical part of quantum physics. Experiments in the 1970s and beyond were showing the reality of such quantum entanglement or non-locality. But although those initial experiments were at the quantum level, now there's been non-locality coherence between organic molecules, buckyfullerenes, which are 60 carbon atoms. And when you get to that sort of scale, then it's a whole different perspective of what non-locality really is. And from my research and perspective, our entire universe essentially is non-locally interconnected.
So people do say, well, it's just a quantum effect, it's below Planck scale, but actually it's coming into larger molecules. So it kind of has an implication for our daily lives if they're non-locally connected.
It does.
And how does it relate to consciousness? I mean, do you think that this implies non-local consciousness is possible?
Well, for me, everything we call reality is consciousness. So essentially, yes, I would say that consciousness, cosmic mind, whatever we want to call it, is intrinsically non-local. It is universal, it is cosmic, it is the oneness of all that is, whatever we might describe it as. And the sort of the evidence and the experience, because I think the experience is crucial, of non-local consciousness is key. And Serena will talk about that. But, telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, all of which I've experienced since childhood and evidenced since childhood, essentially is non-local communication, non-local connectivity of consciousness.
So it's pretty controversial what you just said. I know that Professor Brian Josephson ended up in quite a row, didn't he, when he mentioned non-locality could be an explanation for things like telepathy. Mm-hmm. Why is this so controversial, do you think?
I think it's a rearguard action, actually, by some scientists that are still entrenched in the old paradigm. I think younger scientists, and certainly those cosmologists who are trying to understand the universe as a whole, and those who are trying to integrate quantum theory with relativity, and are recognising that, the understanding of black holes, the understanding, of the holographic principle, of the fractal basis of patterning, and information, are sort of moving into this brave new world where there isn't such sort of, such a perspective.
So it really drops out of the new physics, doesn't it? The new physics of information, of taking it further into, is this consciousness as fundamental? But a lot of people are still clinging on. But actually, there's a lot of evidence for things like telepathy, but it's kind of ignored, isn't it?
Well, the American Institutes of Science, over 15 years ago, actually studied what's called meta-studies of many different experiments. And the meta-studies of what Dean Radin calls supernormal behaviour, they were convinced were proven. The thing is that the sort of sceptical approach is to try and find the evidence of supernormal phenomena through the most unacceptably high bar to prove it. Whereas if we look at sort of medicine, if we look at biology, if we look at many sciences, they are actually based on the same sort of statistical analysis of meta-studies as the supernormal are.
Well, in fact, I saw a very interesting article, actually in New Scientist, which is obviously quite mainstream, and it showed that when you actually see the results of sort of psi studies, sort of Gansfield studies, and the results of the early trials of streptokinase, which is a drug that's used in hospitals all the time, and you don't tell people what the two studies are.
Exactly.
They see that actually the one that's got the psi studies is actually a more powerful study, more statistically significant.
Absolutely.
Until you actually reveal what the studies are. And then suddenly it's like, oh, well, damn the experimenter, damn, So it at the end of the day, then, it all comes down to belief.
It does, and science shouldn't be about belief. Science really should be about following the evidence. And Einstein discovered the relativity of space and time by doing a thought experiment and following a beam of light. I actually feel now we need to follow a thought. And that will take us to a whole new perspective, and that is emerging.
Right, fantastic. So, I mean, just where do you think we're going in the future with this then? But do you see that these younger physicists are taking this on board?
Well, Thomas Kuhn wrote a wonderful book about paradigm shifts, and he actually said that paradigm shifts progress through funerals. Because I think in any, you know, we're all human, and when we have a sort of a status or where there's pressure or whatever, you know, it's difficult to break out of that if your salary is you know, predicated on the fact that you follow a certain line. And I think a lot of physicists have felt that unlike the sort of the early years of the relativity and quantum revolutions, which are incomplete, that instead of being able to follow the evidence wherever it may lead, they're more and more pressurised into staying with an ostensible status quo. But just as at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, phenomena were being discovered that were apparently anomalous. I mean, the whole quantum revolution began with a hot oven, and trying to understand the radiation from it and needing to move from a continuous energy to quantized energy. Otherwise it would have radiated an infinite amount of energy, which my oven doesn't. So I think there are phenomena now, and we're not just talking about dark matter, dark energy, but many other phenomena, including supernormal experimentation, that is like major anomalies vis-a-vis the mainstream paradigm. So I think when that happens, I think the cracks in the dike are there. And younger scientists, who again probably went into science to follow the evidence, want to just do that wherever it leads them. That's the excitement.
Yeah. That's not the reality at the moment, though, is it?
It's more and more. I think we're finding that people are breaking out. And it's funny, you get it at the retired end that says, oh, whatever, I'm following this, and you get it at the younger side of it. But you are also getting some very authoritative mainstream physics, because to understand our universe of physical reality, information is coming forward. And when you get into that area, it really does open Pandora's box.
And a lot of people would argue, you know, if we had some of the mainstream quantum physicists here, they'd go, yes, I'm on board when you say information, but not when you say it has some sort of sentience, when it has some sort of mind.
That's fine for those folks, but I would say there are a growing number of folks who are taking things beyond that perspective and having experiences as I've had since I was a child. And the great thing for me, it wasn't just the experiences, incredibly powerful that they were, it was the fact that I could get evidence from them.
Well, a skeptic could say, you know, Jude, you had nice imagination as a child, you might have had a few hallucinations, whatever.
Sure.
But, you know, that doesn't make information sentient.
No, and I would, that's why I'm a very broad church of consciousness. But sentience is an aspect of that. But what I would say is that when you have a precognitive experience and that precognition happens, when you have a telepathic experience and can actually pick up information.
And of course, people have studied these things
as well.
Dean Radin, for one.
Oh, for heavens! You know, and this is why the American Institutes of Research said, as I say, 15 years ago, these are proven. Now let's see what we can do with it and what it means about human capabilities. And for me, with my experiences, truly, I do experience the world as ultimately sentient.
Okay, so consciousness for you, definitely beyond the brain.
I think that's a tick.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome, Manjir.
Okay,
thank you.
Now we're going for a break now, and we will be joined after the break by Dr Serena Roney-Dougal via Skype. Join us then. Welcome back to the show. We're discussing the nature of consciousness, and joining me on Skype in a moment is Dr Serena Roney-Dougal. Dr Serena is one of the few people in Britain to have obtained a PhD for a thesis in parapsychology. She's gained over 30 years of study in scientific and spiritual explorations of the psyche, and she's an international lecturer on these subjects and has written numerous articles and 2 books, including this one, Where Science and Magic Meet. Welcome to the show, Serena.
Thank you very much.
So I've got to start off by asking you, what exactly is parapsychology?
Oh, parapsychology is scientific research into psychic phenomena, and that includes phenomena such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, out-of-body experiences, reincarnation, ghosts, poltergeists, quite wide-ranging, really.
And how have you been studying these phenomena? Have you been sort of doing lab research, or what sort of studies have you been doing?
Well, I trained at University College London, which is the experimental psychology department. So I do laboratory research, essentially experimental psychology, but with a parapsychological twist.
Right. Okay, so it's both sort of laboratory research as well. And what sort of results have you actually had?
Well, when I did my PhD, I was comparing subliminal perception, which is perception of sensory information that's coming in below the level of conscious awareness. And I compared that with telepathic awareness. And what I found with that was that people who are sensitive and aware of the subliminal and can bring subliminal information into consciousness tend to be people who are aware of psychic information as well. So it seems as though there's a generalized sensitivity to low level, what is normally unconscious information, which is affecting all of us all the time. And we know that from physiological research, but only some people can bring it through into conscious awareness. So that was the PhD. From there, my next experimental research was actually field research, working with a healer who was affecting seed. It was seed being used on an organic farm, and we used actually triple blind methodology. And we found that the seed that he had blessed, sort of like non-contact healing. You see these people who stand holding their hands a little distance away from someone, that sort of work. That seed grew 10% bigger than the other seed and had less fungal disease. So it was both healthier and bigger. And then my latest research has been working in India with yogis and with Tibetan Buddhist monks, looking at the effect of meditation on psychic awareness, because all the Buddhist and yogic teachings state that as you become highly proficient in meditation, so the psychic abilities manifest. And I was looking at that work and found that, yes, the high lamas or the high yogis are definitely more with conscious controlled psychic awareness, definitely more aware than the beginners, the students. But there's a correlation, so that bit by bit, as you do the practice, you see the degree of clarity of the psychic information getting stronger and stronger. And my very latest work has been in Scotland, where we've been looking at the effect of the Earth's magnetic field on psychic awareness. And again, finding a correlation between the intensity of the magnetic activity and decreasing levels of psychic awareness. So the gentler magnetic activity, the less the magnetic activity, the greater we get the clairvoyance and precognition.
Now, you're probably very used to, having studied all these amazing topics for so long, you're probably very used to having a lot of scepticism about these topics as well. But fundamentally, I think from what I gathered from all of the different aspects, for example, when you're talking about the healer with the seeds and the you said it was a triple blind study and you got these significant results, that the plants did much better when the healer had actually blessed them. Now, healing in a way, would you agree with this? It's kind of like a focus of intent and focus of consciousness. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And most healers will consider that when they're doing their healing, they are not in their normal everyday state of consciousness, that they have to focus their attention and in some sense step outside of their normal selves. Now, the healer I worked with, he considered that he was basically just a channel for the energy, and that he went into a sort of meditation state to enable the healing energy, whatever it is, to come through him, work through him. And I know a lot of healers feel that that is the best way to do their work.
Right, okay, I don't think we want to get into a big discussion on what the energy is, but certainly in also what you were talking about, the psychic states, and telepathy, and it implies that there's something about consciousness that can exist beyond the limitation of the brain and have an effect in the world. I mean, would you say that those are the conclusions that you're coming to?
Oh, there's been research over the last 100 years which has built up a huge body of data that says most clearly that there is something to do with consciousness that has a direct effect on the material world. Probably the best of this research is what's called the PAIR Lab, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory. And they spent 25 years looking at the effect between humans and machines. And they used random event generators to randomly create data, asking the people to influence the data that was being created by these machines. And for 25 years, they've got incredibly highly significant results. Oops, sorry, that was my cat who just jumped up. She wants to be on the computer.
Hello, cat.
She's sitting behind it now, so let's hope she just stays there.
So you would say, it seems to me as if you are, having looked at this subject for so many years, you're in the camp that there's something about consciousness that is fundamental to reality.
Oh, I would say most definitely, yes. I think the philosophical term for it is panpsychism, which basically says that consciousness and matter are both primary in the universe. It's not that one comes first and then the other one appears, but within the universe, these are indivisible. They are two sides of the same coin, that where you have one, you have the other. And this is actually a Buddhist philosophy as well. So not only have Western philosophers come to this view, but it's the Buddhist philosophy, and also some parts of Hinduism have this same philosophy, that mind and matter are indivisible, two sides of the same coin.
So some people are coming to it from a viewpoint of quantum theory, and you're coming to it really from a viewpoint of experience. You've done the experiments.
Yes, well, I mean, the experiments that I've been doing have been looking at what I would call much smaller matters than the origins of the universe. However, it was actually my 6 years of work in India that as part of being there, I started to explore initially the yogic philosophies while I was working in the ashram, and then the Buddhist philosophies when I was working with the Tibetan Buddhists in their monasteries. And in reading their philosophies, I just got really intrigued by the Eastern view of consciousness, which is so different from what you learn in the Western psychology, university, academic texts.
So that's really informed a lot of your scientific work, hasn't it? I just want to ask you, if anybody wants to know more, where can they go? If people want to know more about you, do you have a website at all?
Yes, I have a website which is www.psi-researchcentre.co.uk, spelt in the British spelling of centre.
And
so that's my website, and I've also got the couple of books that are available from Amazon.
I have one of these here. So there we go, Where Science and Man. Thank you very much. We'll be posting your website on Facebook as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you for joining us on Hidden Science. And we'll have more explorations for you next time. So see you then. Goodbye.